I'm Nathan Rutherford, and welcome to Myth Madness. This is part 2 of the Greek myths about the hero Theseus. Last episode, I started with Theseus's parents. His father, Aegeus, was the childless king of Athens. Concerned about not having an heir to his throne, he consulted the oracle of Delphi. It gave him the cryptic instructions to not loosen his wineskin until he reached Athens. If he did, the oracle declared he would die of grief. Not sure what to make of this, on his way home he stopped by the palace of his friend, King Phidias of Troezen. Phidias got Aegeus drunk and arranged for him to have sex with Phidias's daughter Aethra. That same night, she also slept with the god Poseidon. From that mixed bag of lovers, she grew pregnant with Theseus. Aegeus guessed Aethra was pregnant, but he had to return to Athens. Before he left, Aegeus placed his sword under a rock. Afterwards, Theseus was born and raised in Troezen, and when he was old enough, he moved the rock and found the sword. He was ready to go and find his father in Athens. Theseus chose to take the dangerous route over land, and along the way, he came face to face with a series of dangerous characters, but killed them all. Eventually, he arrived at Athens, was tasked with capturing a rampaging bull, and was successful. Then, with all that under his belt, Theseus almost got poisoned by the famous witch Medea, who was now living with Aegeus. But, fortunately for Theseus, before it was too late, Aegeus saw that Theseus was carrying the sword he left under the rock so long ago. He saved Theseus and welcomed his son as the heir to the throne of Athens. How's that for a quick recap? This episode picks up from last time with the most famous of Theseus's adventures, his time in Crete with the Minotaur, and his adventures afterwards. As a reminder, as I mentioned last episode, the main sources I'll be referencing for these Theseus myths are Diodorus's Library of History, a collection of Greek myths from the 1st century BC, the Greek historian Plutarch's biography on Theseus, written in the 1st century AD, and finally, Apollodorus's Library, a 2nd century AD collection of various Greek myths. However, the Theseus and the Minotaur story goes much further back to at least the 6th century BC. Great details are provided by the archaic poets Pherecydes and Bacchylides, for example. But before getting to the Minotaur, first it's important to understand some background as to why Athens was tied to Crete. You see, it all started many years before. Minos, the son of Zeus and king of Crete, prayed to the god Poseidon and asked him to show the king his favor. Minos asked for a sign, any sign, but ideally a magnificent bull, and promised to sacrifice the bull once it appeared. Poseidon, ruler of the sea and prospective bovine delivery boy, heard Minos' prayers. Out of the depths of the sea, a big, beautiful bull appeared. But when the king saw just how spectacular the bull was, he decided not to sacrifice it after all. Instead, he kept it and sacrificed one of his own bulls in its place. Poseidon was expecting the bull he sent to Minos, not just any old normal bull. Minos had double-crossed one of the Olympian gods. For his insolence, Minos would pay. First, Poseidon drove the bull wild. It could not be controlled, broke out from its pen, and began to rampage across Crete, tearing up trees, crushing crops, and goring villagers. Then, to turn the punishment up to 11, Poseidon did one more thing. He made it so Minos' queen, Pasiphae, developed an intense lust for the bull. Sometimes Pasiphae's infatuation with the bull is a punishment inflicted by the goddess Aphrodite, but the dominant tradition seems to be that Poseidon was the punisher. Anyway, consumed with her feelings, Pasiphae went to a man named Daedalus. He was a skilled craftsman who worked for King Minos, and she made him promise to help her. So Daedalus built a hollow wooden cow and hid a naked Pasiphae inside of it. Rolling it out to a meadow, the rampaging bull found the fake cow and tried to mount it. With Pasiphae hidden inside, she could allow the bull to have sex with her. So, yeah, there's that. From this affair between queen and bull, Pasiphae grew pregnant and soon gave birth to a boy named Asterios. But this boy was not human. He was half man, half bull. He was the Minotaur, probably the most famous hybrid creature in Greek mythology. After the birth, King Minos tried to figure out what to do with this monster child. He ordered Daedalus to construct a massive labyrinth, basically a glorified cage made of convoluted passages full of twists and turns designed to confuse any unfortunate enough to find themselves within it. Minos placed the Minotaur Asterios inside of it. That's the origins of the Minotaur, but what does this have to do with Athens? For the first links between Crete and Athens, I looked to Diodorus and Plutarch. According to them, while Minos dealt with the Minotaur, in the early years of Aegeus's rule over Athens, Minos' human son, Androgeus, went to Athens to participate in an athletic tournament. He defeated all the competitors, won the tournament, and in the process became friends with a group of 50 brothers collectively called the Palantides. These brothers were cousins to Aegeus and constantly tried to weaken his kingship. Naturally, Aegeus was extremely alarmed by this friendship. He feared the Palantides would convince Androgeus to bring an army from Crete, kick out Aegeus, and make one of the Palantides king. So, what do you know? When Androgeus left the city to travel to another tournament, Aegeus arranged for him to be ambushed and murdered. But Minos was clever. He realized Aegeus was behind the killing of his son. He declared the very war Aegeus tried to prevent. To make matters worse, a terrible drought hit Athens, and its people were plagued with famine. Oracles told them that to save the city, Aegeus needed to make amends with Minos for the murder of Androgeus. In the peace negotiations, Minos decided he wouldn't depose Aegeus after all. Instead, he demanded that 7 young men and 7 young women be sent to Crete to be devoured by the Minotaur every 9 years, as long as the monster lived. Aegeus and the Athenians, not having much choice, reluctantly agreed. The first batch of young people departed and were never seen again. Years passed, and during this time, Theseus came to Athens and reconciled with his father. Eventually, it was time for the next group of young people to be selected. Apollodorus says this was the 3rd tribute sent to the Minotaur, which would make it 18 years after the original agreement was made. This time, Theseus, for whatever reason, was included in this next batch of youths to be sent to Crete. According to Plutarch, Theseus volunteered. When the Cretans arrived to take more youths, the people of Athens grew angry. They were angry because they knew Aegeus was to blame for this situation, but up to now, because he was childless, no one from his family was sent. Theseus, new to Athens and intending to win over his future subjects, offered to share their misfortune. With his son now bound for Crete, Aegeus approached the captain of the ship and made a request of him and Theseus. Previously, the ships used black sails when sailing to and from Crete, but Aegeus supplied a white sail and told the captain that if Theseus survived, on the return journey they should sail back with the white sails, so Aegeus would know what happened before they arrived and would be able to welcome his son if he lived. The different sources are consistent on this arrangement with the sails, but Plutarch also references a poet named Simonides from the 5th century BC. Apparently this older poet said it wasn't a white sail that would signify Theseus' survival, but a bright red sail. Either way, though, there were 2 different colors. Before leaving, Theseus consulted an oracle for advice and made a sacrifice to Apollo. He was instructed to make Aphrodite his guide on the journey. So while waiting on the beach, he sacrificed a goat to the goddess. With that, the young men and women boarded the ship and set off for Crete. On reaching Crete, Aphrodite delivered. Upon seeing Theseus walk down the ramp to take his first steps onto the island, Ariadne, the daughter of Minos, saw the young man and fell in love with him. Knowing Theseus was going to be sent to his death wandering lost in the dark corridors of the labyrinth below the palace, Ariadne approached Theseus. Apollodorus has her offer to help him if he will take her back to Athens and marry her. He agreed, and Theseus was secretly given a ball of golden thread. That night, When he was locked inside the labyrinth, he fastened one end of the thread to the sealed door and then made his way through its twisting passages. At the center of the labyrinth, he found the Minotaur. Apollodorus has Theseus fight the bullman with his bare fists, while the Roman Ovid had him use a club. In most other literary sources, we are only told he killed the creature, not how he did it. But in various examples of Greek vase art going back to the 6th century BC, Theseus holds a sword or long dagger and stabs the Minotaur to death with it. With the bullman dead at his feet, Theseus turned around and followed the thread back to the labyrinth's entrance. The early poet Pherecydes says that before leaving, Theseus sacrificed the Minotaur to Poseidon. That act would accomplish two things: give thanks to his immortal father's patronage, and right the wrong committed by King Minos so long ago when he betrayed Poseidon and reneged on sacrificing the god's bull himself. So that's the traditional version of the myth that most people know today. Theseus is sent to Crete as part of a group of young people. The Cretan princess Ariadne falls in love with Theseus, and she decides to save him. She gives him the golden thread and tells him how to use it. Theseus navigates the labyrinth successfully, finds the Minotaur, and kills it. That outline was first presented by Pherecydes in the 6th century BC, and that outline remained very consistent during the rest of Greek history. The other sources, including my main three for the Theseus myths, follow it exactly, with only a few minor alterations. But the historian Plutarch also shares some other, less mythical feeling versions that are obviously later attempts to rationalize the story. In these, attributed to another writer, the youths sent from Athens were not sent to die in a maze and be eaten by a monster. Instead, they were made to compete in an athletic tournament to honor Minos' dead son Androgeus. After the tournament, they were enslaved and worked in the households of various Cretans, which was why they never returned to Athens. In this version, Theseus participates in the games and was made to wrestle with a powerfully strong Cretan man named Taros. While watching him from the stands, Ariadne fell in love with him. Theseus killed Taros in the match and was crowned the victor of the games. Minos allowed Theseus to return to Athens with the other 13 young men and women and declared the city's debts to Crete were over. So that's Plutarch's rationalization. But if we look away from him for a moment and instead go to the much earlier works of the archaic period poet Bacchylides, we see an even stronger supernatural thread to this story than even the typical outline suggests. According to Bacchylides, when Theseus first arrived on Crete, he actually confronted Minos and told the king he was a son of Poseidon. Minos, as a son of Zeus, took this as a challenge. He threw a ring into the deep waters of the sea and told Theseus that he needed to prove Poseidon was really his father, and that to do so, he would have to dive into the sea and bring back the ring. Theseus bravely accepts and jumps in. The hero goes full Aquaman, and dolphins escort him to Poseidon's palace at the bottom of the sea. There, he meets Poseidon's queen Amphitrite and watches a group of dancing nymphs. Amphitrite gives Theseus fabulous gifts, a beautiful purple robe and a crown covered with roses, which is perhaps a strange detail, since they are underwater. Funny enough, Bacchylides does not say what happened to Minos' ring. Maybe it was just assumed Theseus got it. Maybe the gifts made up for it remaining missing. Either way, though, Theseus returned to the surface. The scene of his return from the bottom of the sea was featured on several examples of Greek art from the 5th century BC. Intriguingly, they follow Bacchylides' descriptions. Theseus is shown with a crown, but a ring is nowhere to be seen. However, many centuries later, another source, Pausanias, does say Theseus returned with both a golden crown and a ring. The Roman Hyginus also mentions the existence of a crown, and says Theseus presented it to the Cretan princess Ariadne. Maybe that was the moment she fell in love with the gallant young hero. Retellings of the Minotaur story usually leave out this swim to the bottom of the sea, and whatever is happening with a crown. This is probably because the main sources for the story don't really go into it, but less well-read later sources return to mentioning crowns. Someone referred to as Pseudo-Aristophanes mentions a crown that glowed and that it helped Theseus get through the labyrinth, as it lighted his way through the dark, twisty corridors. Is this the same crown Bacchylides says Amphitrite gave to Theseus, and he in turn gave to Ariadne? Did she give it back to Theseus in order to save him? Certainly an interesting addition to the story, if that's the case. The literary sources are unfortunately not clear. Sometimes a couple crowns are associated with Ariadne, which makes it a bit muddled. But, in art, there is an archaic period image of two people, possibly Theseus and Ariadne, boarding a boat, and the woman here holds a crown. In another example, an image of a woman holding a crown is actually seated between figures of Theseus and the Minotaur. It's controversial, but maybe this is an early representation of the glowing crown idea, and Theseus taking it into the labyrinth. Anyway, returning to my retelling of the story, regardless of the source, with the exception of Plutarch's rationalization version, Theseus killed the Minotaur, got out of the labyrinth, and in the dead of night escaped Crete with Ariadne in the Athenian ship. Sometimes Theseus was said to have sabotaged or damaged the Cretan ships so they would not pursue them in the morning, and in other cases Minos relented and maybe allowed them to leave. Unfortunately, it was not a happy ending for Theseus and Ariadne. Their ship arrived at the island of Naxos. What happened next, and what happened to Ariadne, varies widely throughout ancient Greek literature. The earliest known source is a one-off line in Homer's Odyssey. In this account, Theseus took Ariadne away from Crete, but we are told he had no joy of her, because when they stopped on the island of Naxos, she was killed by the goddess Artemis due to the witness of Dionysus. That witness of Dionysus piece is not clear, but the usual interpretation is that on the island of Naxos, Theseus and Ariadne slept together in a cave sacred to Dionysus, and for this offense, he had Artemis kill Ariadne. In another version, Dionysus is much more amicable. In fact, he and Ariadne go on to have a relationship. This tradition goes at least as far back as Hesiod in the 7th century BC. In the Theogony, we are told Dionysus made Ariadne his wife, and made her live forever. Many pieces of Greek art from the 6th, 5th, and 4th centuries go on to show Ariadne and Dionysus together in a loving way. Centuries later, Diodorus and Apollodorus tap into the same tradition. They say that Ariadne arrived on Naxos with Theseus, but was taken or kidnapped by Dionysus and married him. Tied up in this, though, is the idea Theseus left Ariadne behind. Diodorus says that upon arriving on Naxos, Theseus had a dream, and in it, Dionysus ordered him to leave Ariadne behind. After he left, Ariadne awoke to find herself all alone. Dionysus appeared and led her away into the night. In all these versions, which cover the whole range of ancient Greek history, Theseus is separated from Ariadne against his will. Additionally, Plutarch claims Theseus established a regular festival called the Oschophoria when he finally returned to Athens. This festival was dedicated to Ariadne and Dionysus, which fits in well with the tradition that Theseus did not callously abandon Ariadne, but was driven to do it against his will. Nevertheless, the most common version known today is that Theseus abandoned Ariadne on purpose. So where does this idea come from? Well, most of the references to it are in sources dating from the 1st century BC and afterwards. The Roman poets Ovid and Hyginus both refer to it, and say Ariadne gained Dionysus as a husband afterwards. The 4th century AD Greek poet Nonnus is the most explicit, saying Theseus left her without pity. With Plutarch, we actually might have a reason why Theseus might have treated Ariadne this way. Apparently Theseus was also attracted to a young Athenian woman named Aglae, and left Ariadne so he could go back to her. But Plutarch also covers the other tradition too. He relates a story where Ariadne was already pregnant when Theseus' ship reached an island. The men, put her on land because she was feeling ill, but the ship was pulled out again by the sea's currents and she was left there. The women of the island took care of her until she tragically died before she could give birth. Theseus did return to the island, but by then, Ariadne was already dead. In this story, Ariadne did not give birth to Theseus's child, but this was not always the case. In different sources, she has children named Thoas, Staphylos, Oinopion, and Peperothos. Sometimes all four of these are Dionysus' sons, but in some versions, Oinopion and Staphylos were her children with Theseus. As you can see, there is a complicated mix going on with Ariadne. Sometimes she is kidnapped by Dionysus, sometimes she is saved by him, sometimes she is abandoned by Theseus, and sometimes she dies or is left because it is her destiny to marry Dionysus. Sometimes this all happens soon after leaving Crete, and sometimes it's at enough time afterwards for her to be pregnant, or having already given birth to Theseus's children. Either way, though, Ariadne always ends up with Dionysus eventually, and never makes her way back to Athens with Theseus. Once Ariadne is gone, sailing on, the Athenian ship approached the coast of mainland Greece, either because they were overjoyed to have survived their stay in Crete, or because they were deeply saddened at the loss of Ariadne. Theseus and the ship captain forgot to change the sails. From a high place on the mainland, Aegeus was watching for news of his son. He saw the ship appear in the distance, with black sails blowing in the wind. Thinking Theseus was dead, Aegeus, devastated, hurled himself off the cliff to his own death. And with that, the oracle's cryptic foretelling from so many years before was complete. By loosing his wineskin and having sex with Aethra, Aegeus got a son, but it was the thought of his own son's death that made Aegeus die of grief. Meanwhile, Theseus arrived at a port and sent a messenger ahead to inform people of his return. The messenger found the city of Athens in a sorry state, with people mourning the death of the king. But many were glad to hear the news of Theseus's return, and he was crowned in garlands when he arrived. Theseus buried his father and made a sacrifice to Apollo. He was now the new king of Athens. Now back in Athens, and crowned as its king, but without Ariadne who he promised to marry, Theseus was now in need of a queen, and he got one in a couple different ways. In another Theseus adventure, the hero ends up in the lands of the Amazons, that fierce tribe of warrior women that pop up occasionally in several Greek myths. There are two general versions for this story. In one, Theseus joined Heracles when he went to the land of the Amazons to fetch the belt of Hippolyta, one of his 12 labors. However, in the other version, Theseus made his own separate voyage to the Amazons without Heracles. What happened was Theseus sailed a ship to the Amazon homeland, took one of the women captive, usually named Antiope but sometimes Hippolyta, and brought her back to Athens. In one detailed account, when Theseus's ship arrived at their homeland, the Amazons were friendly and sent him gifts. Theseus invited the woman bringing the gifts onto the ship, and then sailed away with her still on board. But the Amazons were not going to simply let him kidnap their comrade. They followed Theseus to Athens and attacked the city, even managing to encamp in the city center. It seems Antiope was not overly concerned with her own kidnapping. Plutarch records that she may have been killed in the battle fighting alongside Theseus, or that she acted as an envoy to create a peace treaty. In some versions, she also had a son with Theseus named Hippolytus, who Theseus sent to be raised by his mother Aethra and grandfather Pityus. Besides the Amazon, Theseus also gained another woman as a queen, and this story once again ties Athens back to Crete. The first part is best detailed by Diodorus, but other writers reference it too. Sometime after Theseus became king of Athens, and usually after the incident with the Amazons, King Minos of Crete died, and his son, Deucalion, became the new king. Deucalion did not hold a grudge against Theseus for the killing of the Minotaur or the loss of his sister Ariadne. The new Cretan king wanted to let bygones be bygones and establish an alliance with Athens. As part of the deal, Deucalion arranged a marriage between Theseus and his sister Phaedra, and she was sent to join her future husband in Athens. Ironically, after the whole business with Ariadne, Theseus still years later ended up with one of King Minos' daughters as a wife. Theseus and Phaedra went on to have at least 2 sons, named Acamas and Demophoon. Like their father, these 2 would go on to have their own adventures, but Phaedra would have a tragic end. There are several different accounts of this next myth. The earliest is by the Athenian poet Euripides in the 5th century BC. Later writers, Diodorus, Ovid, and Seneca, also focus on it. All of them are fairly consistent, but with some minor variations. Usually, the problems start when Theseus and Phaedra visit Troezen, the place where Theseus grew up. Remember that Theseus previously sent his son with the Amazon to live in Troezen. While staying there, Phaedra developed an intense desire for her stepson, Hippolytus, who was a handsome hunter and sportsman. But in every version, Hippolytus has a woman problem. He either seems to outright hate women, or we get a perspective that he is an incredibly devout worshipper of Artemis and has sworn himself to celibacy. Either way, when he hears about Phaedra's desire for him, either from her directly or from a messenger, he is disgusted and turns her down. The consequences of this are ultimately the death of both, but this happens in different ways. In Euripides' play, Phaedra, consumed by shame, kills herself, but leaves a letter for Theseus informing him that Hippolytus tried to rape her. An angry Theseus exiles Hippolytus, prays to Poseidon, and curses his son. Meanwhile, while Hippolytus leaves by chariot, he loses control of the horses, crashes, and dies, likely as a result of the curse. At the end of the tragedy, Theseus is informed by Artemis that Hippolytus was innocent, and that Phaedra's lust for him was the work of the goddess Aphrodite, who wanted to punish Hippolytus for his extreme zeal and refusal to honor her in any way. What's interesting, though, is this play was actually Euripides' second attempt to tell the story. The first play was not well received by Athenian audiences. It's lost to history, but it's widely believed to have portrayed a very lusty Phaedra who actively pursued Hippolytus. When the Athenians didn't like this depiction, Euripides reworked it, having Phaedra instead be a victim of Aphrodite's powers, and Hippolytus finding out about Phaedra's desire from a servant. Personally, I don't think the passive Phaedra turn to this story really explains why she needed to falsely accuse Hippolytus of rape before killing herself. But hey, this is a tragedy, and all the characters in it have some personal issues. In the short version recorded by Diodorus, the opposite happens. Phaedra raises the accusation, and then when Theseus goes to interview Hippolytus, she fears being caught and kills herself. Hippolytus dies in a chariot crash anyway. The Roman poet Seneca also has a more active Phaedra accuse Hippolytus, because according to Seneca, a crime must be concealed by a crime. There's some really interesting divergences in the different versions of the story, even though the basic plot points are much the same. It really makes for good Greek tragedy, as the poets were free to really drill down and explore the motivations of their characters. Plutarch's biography on the life of Theseus was focused on telling the story of the legendary king of Athens. Even though he wasn't the mythical founder king, Theseus was an important founder king. Important because to Plutarch and many Athenians, Theseus was supposed to have set the stage for Athens' transition from monarchy to democracy. Because of that, Plutarch glosses over episodes like the killing of the Minotaur and tries to tie Theseus in with setting up various institutions of real-world Athens. For example, Plutarch had Theseus promise to not be a king, but make Athens into a democracy, where he would only be the commander in times of war and the guardian of the city's laws, while everyone else was equal. To do this, Theseus reorganized Athens' society, Plutarch implies Theseus divided all of the citizens into 10 groups, based on where they lived rather than on their wealth. But we know this was actually done by a real-life Athenian leader named Clisthenes in 508 BC. Finally, in Plutarch's biography, Theseus also coined Athens' first money, which he stamped with a picture of the Marathonian bull. But in the real world, these coins were very much a later invention. In addition to these attempts to tie Theseus into real-world Athens, the people of the city, especially through its storytellers and playwrights, linked him to many other mythic exploits as well. Sometimes Theseus is included in other heroes' adventures. Some sources, confusingly, put him as a crew member in Jason's voyage to get the Golden Fleece, and other versions make it clear he was unable to join. Other sources have him help Meleager slay the Caledonian boar, join heroes in a fight against centaurs, and many other things too. Theseus's main myth tradition is his adventure with the Minotaur, which we know goes back to at least the time of Homer in the 8th century BC. Many of these later associations were added in the following centuries to further develop the myths about him. So, in the next few episodes, Theseus is going to appear, and I'll cover a few more of his adventures as I cover the myths of some other heroes. But before leaving off, a moment for how Theseus died. Eventually, Theseus ended up trapped in the underworld after attempting to help another hero kidnap the goddess Persephone. With Theseus absent, Athens began to break apart into warring factions once again. Time passed by, and the hero Heracles released Theseus when he visited the underworld while completing his final labor. Theseus returned to Athens, ready to retake his position as king, but too much time had passed. When he came back, he found he was unwanted and unable to overcome the various factions working against him. He said goodbye to Athens forever and sailed away to the island of Skyros. At first, Lycomedes, the king of Skyros, welcomed Theseus, but he secretly feared the arrival of the former Athenian king. Power is not easily given up, and kings never retire. Lycomedes worried that the famous Theseus would try and depose him and take Skyros for himself. So one day, soon after Theseus arrived, Lycomedes led him up to the top of a cliff, probably offering to show him the great view of the island below. Once the two were at the top, Lycomedes pushed Theseus over the edge. And just like that, like his father so many years before, Theseus fell to his death. And that's all for now. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. As always, thank you for listening.